You've seen this island before. In textbooks, travel magazines, documentary specials, social media feeds filled with sunset silhouettes, the giant stone heads staring at the horizon. Easter Island, one of the most recognizable places on Earth. Almost everyone can picture it, a remote island in the Pacific. Ancient statues, a mysterious civilization, a warning about ecological collapse. The story has been told thousands of times, but there's something we don't talk about when we talk about Easter Island. The people are still there, not as a footnote to archaeological discovery, not as descendants who exist to explain the past to tourists, as a living community whose land was taken, whose population was decimated, whose autonomy was stripped away, while the world became fascinated with the stones their ancestors carved. This island has a name the people who live there use, Rapa Nui, not Easter Island. That name came from a Dutch explorer who arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722 and decided his calendar was more important than whatever the people who lived there called their home. The Moai, those monolithic stone figures, have become global icons. They appear in museums from London to Santiago. They're featured in animated films, referenced in popular culture, studied by archaeologists, protected by UNESCO. The statues are famous. The people who carved them are not. This is Rapa Nui, and this is the story about what happens when the world falls in love with a place's past but ignores its present. When preservation becomes more important than people, when an island becomes a symbol and its inhabitants become invisible. The world thinks it knows Easter Island. It doesn't. Rapa Nui sits 3,700 kilometers from the coast of Chile, 2,000 kilometers from Pitcairn, its nearest inhabited neighbor. It is one of the most isolated pieces of inhabited land on Earth, a 164 square kilometer triangle of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. People arrived here sometime between 800 and 1200 AD. The exact date is debated, but the fact is clear. Polynesian voyagers crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean in double-hulled canoes and found this island. Not by accident, by navigation, using stars, currents, bird patterns, and knowledge accumulated over generations of seafaring. They brought everything they needed to establish a permanent settlement: taro, sweet potatoes, chickens, bananas, the plants and animals that would sustain them. They called the island Tepito o Tehenilwa, the navel of the world. The society that developed on Rapa Nui was complex and stratified. There were chiefs, ariki, who held political and spiritual authority. There were priests who maintained oral histories and performed rituals. There were craftsmen who specialized in different forms of work: stone carving, agriculture, fishing, construction. The island was divided into territories, each controlled by a different clan. Competition between clans drove much of Rapa Nui's development. Not just territorial disputes, but cultural competition. Which clan could construct the most impressive ceremonial platform, ahu? Which could carve the largest statue? The Moai were not mysteries. They were not built by aliens or lost civilizations or forgotten technologies. They were carved by people using stone tools, basalt picks to rough out the shape in the volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku crater, coral abrasives to smooth and detail the features. The statues represented ancestors, deified chiefs. They were placed on ahu platforms overlooking clan territories, their backs to the sea, watching over the living. They embodied mana, spiritual power. The larger and more elaborate the moai, the more mana it concentrated. Carving a moai was a communal project that could take months or years. Moving them from the quarry to their final positions required coordination, engineering knowledge, and significant labor. The most widely accepted theory involves using ropes and a rocking motion to walk the statues upright across the landscape. Others suggest sleds and rollers. Either way, it required skill, not magic. At the peak of Rapa Nui civilization, perhaps 15,000 people lived on the island. They had developed sophisticated agricultural systems. They built stone chicken coops to protect their primary protein source from rats, which had arrived with the original settlers and multiplied rapidly. They constructed elaborate ceremonial sites. They maintained complex social structures. They also transformed their environment significantly. The island had once been forested. Palm trees covered much of the interior. By the 1600s, most of those forests were gone, cut down for construction, agriculture, and transporting Moai. The loss of forest affected the island's ecology. Soil erosion increased, native bird species declined, the ability to build large ocean-going canoes diminished. There's a narrative that's been told repeatedly about Rapa Nui, that the people destroyed their environment through reckless overexploitation, that they kept building bigger statues even as resources depleted, that they collapsed into warfare and cannibalism, that Easter Island is a cautionary tale about ecological suicide. That narrative is convenient. It suggests that collapse was inevitable, that the Rapa Nui people failed because of their own choices. It turns the island into a parable. But the reality is more complicated. Environmental change did occur. Resources became more constrained. Competition increased. But societies adapt. Rapa Nui was adapting. Agricultural intensification, shift from forest resources to marine resources, changes in social organization. The Rapa Nui people were managing their situation. Populations had stabilized by the time Europeans arrived. Moai construction had slowed but hadn't stopped. The society was still functioning. What destroyed Rapa Nui wasn't ecological collapse. It was contact with the outside world.
On April 5, 1722, 3 Dutch ships under the command of Jacob Roggeveen arrived at Rapa Nui. They stayed 1 day, long enough to note that the island was inhabited, that there were remarkable tall stone figures, and that the people seemed friendly but poor. Also long enough to kill approximately a dozen islanders. The shooting started over a misunderstanding. Someone took something from a Dutch sailor. The Dutch responded with musket fire. Bodies fell. The Dutch left. This was first contact, violence, death, and a name the islanders never chose, Easter Island. For the next 48 years, European ships occasionally passed the island. Some stopped briefly. Others just noted it on charts. Each visit brought the possibility of disease, violence, and disruption. In 1770, a Spanish expedition arrived. They claimed the island for Spain. They erected crosses. They had local chiefs sign documents written in Spanish, which the chiefs could not read. The Spanish called the island San Carlos. Then they left. Spain never returned. The claim meant nothing except on paper in a Madrid archive. In 1774, British Captain James Cook arrived. His expedition stayed 4 days. Cook was less impressed than Roggeveen had been. He noted that many of the Moai had been toppled. He observed that the population seemed smaller than the island's infrastructure suggested it should be. He described the people as small, lean, timid, and miserable. Cook's expedition physician estimated the population at about 700 people. This was likely an undercount. Other estimates suggest 2,000 to 3,000. But even the higher number represents a catastrophic decline from the estimated 15,000 at peak population. What happened between 1722 and 1774? We don't know precisely. No written records exist from the Rapa Nui perspective, but the pattern is consistent with what happened on other Pacific islands after European contact. Disease. European ships brought pathogens the islanders had never encountered: smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, venereal diseases. Island populations with no immunity experienced devastating mortality rates. 50%, 70%, 90% in some cases. Social disruption. The arrival of outsiders with weapons, metal tools, and foreign ideas destabilized existing power structures. Competition between clans intensified. Warfare increased. The toppling of Moai, Huri Moai, became a way to destroy rival clans' mana. But the worst was yet to come. In December 1862, Peruvian ships arrived at Rapa Nui. They were slave raiders. Over several days, they captured approximately 1,500 people, more than half the island's population. They were taken to Peru to work in guano mines and on plantations. The slavers targeted the elite, chiefs, priests, skilled craftsmen, the people who held knowledge, the ones who could read rongo-rongo, the unique script developed on Rapa Nui. The cultural and intellectual leadership of the island was systematically removed. International pressure eventually forced Peru to return the enslaved Rapa Nui. Of the 1,500 taken, only about 100 survived to make the return journey. And during that journey, they brought smallpox back to the island. The epidemic that followed killed approximately 90% of the remaining population. By 1877, only 111 people remained on Rapa Nui. From an estimated 15,000 at contact to 111 survivors in less than 160 years. This wasn't an ecological collapse, this was genocide. Not systematic extermination by a single actor, but the cumulative effect of disease, slavery, and violence that destroyed a population. The rongo-rongo script died with the priests and scribes who were taken in the slave raids. The knowledge of how to carve and move moai died with the master craftsmen. Oral histories, genealogies, religious practices, all diminished as elders died without enough young people to pass knowledge to. By the time anthropologists became interested in Rapa Nui culture in the late 1800s, most of it was already gone. What we know about pre-contact Rapa Nui comes from fragmented memories, archaeological evidence, and the observations of European visitors who barely understood what they were seeing. The Rapa Nui people survived, 111 people, but their world had ended.
In 1864, French missionary Eugene Ayrault arrived on Rapa Nui. He was the first European to live on the island for an extended period. He established a Catholic mission. He began converting the population. Within a few years, most surviving Rapa Nui people had been baptized. This wasn't entirely voluntary. Missionaries controlled access to resources and Western goods. They had connections to the outside world. In a desperate situation, conversion was pragmatic. In 1866, French adventurer Jean-Baptiste Dutrou-Bornier arrived. He saw opportunity, land, cheap labor, no effective government oversight. He began purchasing land from the few Rapa Nui who held title under traditional systems. Purchase is a generous term. Coercion, manipulation, and exploitation describe it more accurately. Dutrou-Bornier wanted to establish a sheep ranch. He partnered with a Tahitian trading company. They imported thousands of sheep. The sheep needed grazing land. The Rapa Nui people lived on that land. Dutrou-Bornier began forcing the Rapa Nui population to leave the island. He convinced many to relocate to Tahiti, promising better conditions. Once they left, they couldn't return. By 1871, only about 230 people remained on Rapa Nui. The island was being emptied to make room for sheep. In 1888, Chile decided to annex Rapa Nui, not through negotiation with the Rapa Nui people, through a treaty with one of the islanders, a man named Atamu Tekena, who may or may not have had the authority to make such an agreement. The treaty was written in Spanish. It's unclear how much Tekena understood. Chile claimed the document gave them sovereignty over the island. The Rapa Nui people believed they were agreeing to protection, not annexation. The distinction matters. If it was annexation, the Rapa Nui people lost their independence. If it was a protection agreement, they retained sovereignty. Chile acted as if it owned the island. The Rapa Nui people were not consulted about this interpretation. Chile immediately leased the entire island to a Chilean company, Williamson Balfour, then to Compañía Explotadora de Isla de Pascua, CEDIP. These companies ran Rapa Nui as a private sheep ranch from 1888 to 1953, 65 years. The Rapa Nui people were confined to Hangaroa, a settlement covering about 10% of the island. The rest, their ancestral lands, their ceremonial sites, their agricultural areas, was off-limits, fenced off for sheep. The company controlled everything: employment, food rations, movement. The Rapa Nui people needed written permission to leave Hangaroa. Permission was rarely granted. They were prisoners on their own island. Children were sent to boarding schools run by Catholic missions. They were punished for speaking Rapa Nui language, forced to speak Spanish. Cultural practices were suppressed as primitive or pagan. The goal was assimilation: make them Chilean, erase what made them Rapa Nui. The Chilean government provided minimal oversight. The island was remote, communication was difficult. What happened on Rapa Nui stayed on Rapa Nui. Company managers had essentially unchecked authority. Labor conditions were exploitative. Rapa Nui men worked on the ranch for minimal wages paid in company scrip, not real currency. Scrip could only be used at the company store, which charged inflated prices. It was a system designed to keep workers perpetually indebted. Women worked as domestic servants for company staff. Abuse was common. There was no recourse, no courts, no protection. The company manager was judge, jury, and executioner. Living conditions in Hangaroa deteriorated. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, limited health care. The population remained small. In 1934, there were only 456 Rapa Nui people. The combination of disease, poor living conditions, and low birth rates kept the population suppressed. In 1914, a British anthropologist named Catherine Routledge visited Rapa Nui. She documented the situation. She wrote about the confinement, the exploitation, the destruction of culture. Her work raised some international awareness, but produced no meaningful change. In 1934, the Rapa Nui people rioted. They had had enough. They demanded an end to the company's control. They wanted their land back. Chilean naval forces suppressed the uprising. The leaders were punished. Conditions worsened. After World War II, international attention began focusing on human rights and decolonization, but Rapa Nui wasn't a colony in the formal sense. It was Chilean territory. What Chile did on its own land was its business. Finally, in 1953, Chile ended the company lease and took direct control of the island. But this didn't return land to the Rapa Nui people. Chile simply became the landlord instead of the company. In 1966, Chile established direct governance. They appointed a Chilean governor. Rapa Nui people were finally granted Chilean citizenship. This was framed as progress, but it came with conditions. To be Chilean citizens, they had to accept Chilean sovereignty. Their land was Chilean land. Their home was a Chilean territory. In 1966, the island's first airport opened, built by the United States as a backup landing site for space missions. The runway was long enough for jets. Suddenly, Rapa Nui was accessible. Tourists could visit. Scientists could conduct research. The world could finally see the island. And the world was very interested in the statues.
By the mid-20th century, Easter Island had become a scientific fascination. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and researchers from around the world wanted to study the Moai, the Ahu platforms, the mysterious Rongo Rongo tablets. But they weren't particularly interested in the living Rapa Nui people. 4 Heyerdahl arrived in 1955. His expedition lasted months. He excavated sites. He conducted experiments moving Moai replicas. He documented his findings extensively. His work popularized Easter Island globally. His book, Aku Aku, became an international bestseller. Heyerdahl's theories were controversial. He suggested the Moai might have been built by South American peoples, not Polynesians. He proposed contact between pre-Columbian Americans and Rapa Nui. Most of his theories were later disproven, but his work established Easter Island as a place of mystery and wonder. The mystery narrative was compelling. Remote island, giant statues, lost civilization, ecological collapse. It had everything a good story needed. Publishers loved it. Documentary filmmakers loved it. Tourists loved it. The actual Rapa Nui people, their history, their current situation, their perspectives, were largely absent from these narratives. They appeared in Heyerdahl's work as laborers helping excavate sites or subjects of anthropological observation, not as authorities on their own history. In 1995, UNESCO designated Rapa Nui National Park as a World Heritage Site. The designation recognized outstanding universal value of the archaeological remains. It aimed to protect the Moai and Ahu from damage and deterioration. Protection sounds positive, and in some ways it was. The designation brought international attention. It established conservation standards. It provided some funding for preservation work. But it also reinforced a particular relationship with the island. Rapa Nui was important because of what ancient people built. The present-day population was relevant primarily as caretakers of the past. The UNESCO designation covered about 43% of the island, essentially all the major archaeological sites. Management of these sites fell to CONAF, Chile's National Forest Corporation. A Chilean government agency controlled access to and use of Rapa Nui's most sacred and culturally significant places. The Rapa Nui people could visit these sites as tourists, with tickets, following rules set by outsiders about how to interact with their own ancestors' creations. Tourism exploded. The airport expanded. Hotels were built. Tour operators established businesses. By the 2000s, over 100,000 tourists visited Rapa Nui annually. The island's economy became almost entirely dependent on tourism. For the Rapa Nui people, this created complicated dynamics. Tourism brought money, jobs as guides, hotel workers, restaurant staff. Some Rapa Nui people established their own tourism businesses. Economic conditions improved significantly compared to the mid-20th century. But the relationship was fundamentally unequal. The tourists came to see statues, not to understand the people. They wanted sunset photos with Moai. They wanted to hear about ancient mysteries. They didn't want to hear about land rights disputes or colonial history. The English image of Easter Island crystallized. Remote, mysterious, beautiful. A bucket list destination, a place where ancient people achieved remarkable feats before mysteriously collapsing. This narrative served many purposes. It made good marketing for tourism. It provided material for documentaries and books. It offered a cautionary environmental parable. What it didn't do was center the Rapa Nui people, their voices, their struggles, their ongoing fight for autonomy and land rights. The statues became more famous than the living culture. The past became more important than the present. Easter Island, the symbol, overshadowed Rapa Nui, the home. Museums around the world hold Rapa Nui artifacts. The British Museum has a Moai. The Louvre has Rongo Rongo tablets. Museums in New York, Santiago, and elsewhere display objects taken from the island, often during the colonial period, when taking such things wasn't called theft. The Rapa Nui people have repeatedly requested return of these artifacts. Some requests have been granted, most have not. The museums argue the artifacts are better preserved in climate-controlled facilities, that they're accessible to more people in major museums, that they're part of human heritage, not just Rapa Nui heritage. The subtext, we can take care of your culture better than you can. Your objects are safer with us. The world's interest in your heritage supersedes your claim to it. In 1995, the Rapa Nui people established their own parliament. the Honui. Not recognized by Chile, not granted any official authority, but functioning as a body through which the Rapa Nui people could assert collective positions. Their primary demand, land rights. Return of ancestral lands currently controlled by the Chilean government. Recognition of Rapa Nui autonomy. The right to determine how their island is used and developed. Chile's response has been mixed. Some symbolic acknowledgments, some minor land returns, but fundamental questions of sovereignty remain unresolved. In 2010, Rapa Nui activists occupied the Hangaroa Hotel, a government-owned facility built on disputed land. The occupation lasted months. It ended with police forces removing the occupiers, sometimes violently. Images circulated of Chilean police in riot gear confronting Rapa Nui people on their own island. The contrast was stark. Chile spent millions protecting and promoting the archaeological park that brought tourist revenue. But when the Rapa Nui people demanded control over their own land, they were met with police force. The Moai were valuable. The people were problems.
Today, approximately 8,000 people live on Rapa Nui. About 60% identify as Rapa Nui. The rest are Chilean mainlanders who moved to the island for work opportunities, mostly in tourism. The island has modern infrastructure, electricity, running water, internet, schools, a hospital, regular flights to Santiago. By external measures, living conditions are comfortable. But beneath the surface, tensions remain. The question of who controls Rapa Nui is still unresolved. Chile maintains sovereignty. The island is part of the Valparaiso region. Chilean law applies. The Chilean government makes final decisions about development, land use, and resource management. The Rapa Nui people have limited self-governance. They elect a mayor and council for Hangaroa, but major decisions require approval from Chilean authorities. The national park, most of the island, is still managed by CONAF, though there's been increasing Rapa Nui involvement in management decisions. Land ownership remains contentious. Much of the island is technically state-owned. The Rapa Nui people argue this land was illegally taken and should be returned. Chile points to the 1888 treaty and subsequent legal frameworks as establishing legitimate state ownership. In 2007, Chile passed the Indigenous Peoples Law, which included some provisions for Rapa Nui. Land commissions were established to review claims. Some lands have been returned to Rapa Nui ownership, but the process is slow, bureaucratic, and often unsatisfying to claimants. The fundamental issue, Chile wants to maintain sovereignty. The Rapa Nui people want autonomy. These positions are difficult to reconcile. Chile has no precedent for granting substantial autonomy to indigenous territories. The Rapa Nui people have no leverage to force the issue beyond moral pressure and international advocacy. Tourism continues to grow. Pre-pandemic, 150,000 tourists visited annually. That's 18 tourists for every permanent resident. The economic impact is significant. Tourism generates about 80% of the island's economy. But tourism creates problems: environmental impact on fragile archaeological sites, strain on infrastructure, rising cost of living that makes the island unaffordable for many Rapa Nui people, cultural commodification where traditions become performances for tourists. There's also the question of narrative control. Tour guides tell stories about the Moai, but whose stories? Many guides are Chilean mainlanders, not Rapa Nui. They repeat the standard narratives: mysterious statues, ecological collapse, ancient wisdom. Rapa Nui guides tell different stories about ancestors, about colonization, about ongoing struggles. But tourists often prefer the mystery narrative. It's more exciting, less politically uncomfortable. The COVID-19 pandemic created an unexpected pause. Tourism stopped. The island was cut off. For 2 years, the Rapa Nui people lived without tourists for the first time in decades. Some reports described it as a relief. The island felt like theirs again, quieter, less chaotic. Archaeological sites were empty. People could visit without crowds. but economically it was devastating. No tourism meant no income for most families. The pandemic highlighted the dangerous dependency on a single economic sector controlled by external forces. When tourism resumed, there were calls to limit visitor numbers, to implement stricter environmental protections, to ensure more Rapa Nui control over tourism operations. Some changes were made, but the fundamental dynamic remains. The island needs tourist money, and tourists want access to sites and experiences. Cultural preservation is another ongoing challenge. The Rapa Nui language is endangered. While efforts to teach it in schools have increased, Spanish remains dominant. Young people often speak Spanish primarily. Rapa Nui becomes a heritage language rather than a living one. Traditional knowledge about navigation, agriculture, cultural practices exists in fragments. Elders hold memories, but transmission to younger generations is incomplete. The disruption of colonization created gaps that can't fully be filled. There are revival efforts, language programs, cultural centers, traditional navigation projects, annual Tapati Rapa Nui Festival celebrating indigenous culture. These efforts matter. They maintain connection to heritage. They assert cultural identity in the face of assimilation pressure. But they're also, in some ways, performing culture for an audience. The festival attracts tourists. Cultural programs receive funding because they support tourism. There's a complicated relationship between authentic cultural practice and what needs to be displayed to justify the island's economic model. The Rapa Nui people are navigating an impossible situation. They want autonomy but need Chilean infrastructure support. They want to preserve culture but operate in a globalized economy. They want control over their land but have limited legal standing to claim it. They're not tragic victims waiting to be saved. They're not living relics of the past. They're a contemporary indigenous people dealing with the ongoing legacy of colonization while trying to build a sustainable future on their own terms. The island everyone knows is not the island they live on. The symbol is not the reality. The past is not the present.
The world preserved the Moai. Over 900 statues across the island. Various stages of completion, some still in the quarry, never finished, others on Ahu platforms, painstakingly restored by archaeologists, others lying where they fell when they were toppled centuries ago. The statues are protected by law. Touching them without authorization is prohibited. Climbing on them is illegal. Conservation teams monitor them for deterioration. When damage occurs, experts from around the world arrive to assess and repair. Millions of dollars have been spent preserving these stones. They deserve preservation. They represent extraordinary human achievement. They're irreplaceable cultural heritage. But consider what was not preserved with the same urgency. The people themselves. When their population collapsed to 111, there was no international intervention, no emergency relief, no conservation effort for human lives. The language. When elders who spoke only Rapa Nui died, nobody recorded their knowledge systematically until much of it was already lost. The land rights. When companies fenced off the island, when the Chilean state claimed sovereignty, nobody defended the Rapa Nui people's ownership of their ancestral territory. The Rongorongo tablets. When priests who could read them were enslaved and died in Peru, nobody rushed to document the script before that knowledge vanished. The autonomy. When Chile annexed the island through a treaty that may have been misunderstood, nobody questioned whether the Rapa Nui people had truly consented to losing their independence. The pattern is clear. Physical objects were worth preserving. Living culture was not. Stone statues mattered more than the people who carved them. This isn't unique to Rapa Nui. It's a pattern repeated globally. Indigenous peoples whose territories become valued for resources, tourism, or symbolic significance often find their heritage protected while their rights are ignored. The heritage is extracted and preserved elsewhere. Museums full of artifacts removed from original contexts, photographs in archives, recordings in ethnographic collections. The culture exists in fragments, cataloged and studied by outsiders. Meanwhile, the people themselves, living, changing, adapting, are expected to remain static.
to be authentic representatives of the past, to perform their culture in ways that match outsiders' expectations. If they change too much, they're accused of losing their culture. If they demand rights, they're accused of being political. If they commercialize their heritage, they're accused of selling out. They can't win. The Rapa Nui people were expected to be grateful for attention to their island, grateful for archaeological research, grateful for tourist interest, grateful for UNESCO designation. But attention without justice is just surveillance. Interest without respect is just consumption. Preservation without autonomy is just colonialism with better PR. What the world chose to remember, the statues are amazing. The ancient people were skilled. The island is mysterious and beautiful. What the world chose to forget, the people are still there. Their land was stolen. Their population was devastated by disease and slavery. They have no control over their own territory. They live under Chilean sovereignty they never fully consented to. The forgetting is not passive, it's active. It requires effort to tell the story of Easter Island without centering colonization, to focus on ancient achievement while ignoring modern injustice, to treat the island as a cautionary tale about environmental collapse while never mentioning that the collapse was driven largely by external forces. There are documentaries about how the Moai were built, how they were moved, what they represented, theories debated, experiments conducted, books written, papers published. There are far fewer documentaries about what happened after 1722, about the slave raids, about the land theft, about the confinement to Hongaroa, about the ongoing struggle for autonomy. That story is less marketable. It makes people uncomfortable. It complicates the narrative. It raises questions about who has the right to control and profit from indigenous heritage. So we return to the statues. Always the statues. They're safe. They're ancient. They're not asking for anything. They don't complicate our vacation plans or challenge our assumptions. The world built an entire mythology around Easter Island as an environmental parable, a warning on unsustainable resource use, about hubris, about civilizations that destroy themselves through short-sighted decisions. There's utility in that narrative. It serves as a metaphor for current environmental challenges, but it's fundamentally misleading. It suggests the Rapa Nui people's suffering was self-inflicted, that they're responsible for their own collapse. The truth, they were adapting to environmental constraints when Europeans arrived with diseases, weapons, and imperial ambitions. The collapse was not ecological, it was colonial. But acknowledging that requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how the modern world was built, about which people were sacrificed so others could prosper, about ongoing systems of inequality and exploitation. It's easier to blame the victims, to say they cut down too many trees, to say they were obsessed with building bigger statues, to make them a cautionary tale rather than survivors of genocide. The Moai have become global symbols. They appear in advertising, in films, in art. They're instantly recognizable, iconic. But most people who recognize them couldn't tell you anything about the Rapa Nui people today, where they live, how many there are, what challenges they face, what they want for their future. The symbols have eclipsed the people. The past has erased the present.
Easter Island is everywhere. In museums, in books, in documentaries, on Instagram. It's one of the most famous places on Earth. Everyone knows the statues. Everyone has seen the images. The island that nobody knows is Rapa Nui, the place where people live, work, raise families, fight for rights, navigate impossible complications, build futures under constraints they didn't choose. The Rapa Nui people are not asking the world to stop being interested in the Moai. The statues are their ancestors. They're proud of what their people achieved. They understand the cultural significance. But they're asking for something the world has been reluctant to provide: voice, agency, control over their own heritage and territory, the right to tell their own story, to be more than custodians of ruins, to be more than exotic subjects in someone else's documentary. They're asking for land rights that should never have been taken, for autonomy that should never have been stripped away, for recognition that they're not historical artifacts, they're a living people with contemporary concerns. The world has shown it can mobilize resources to preserve stones, millions of dollars, international cooperation, expert attention, legal protections. Imagine if that same energy had been directed toward preserving people, toward supporting indigenous rights, toward ensuring that the Rapa Nui people had control over their own land and destiny. The statues would still be standing, but so would justice. There's a question at the heart of Rapa Nui's story, a question that extends far beyond this one island, a question about how we value heritage and who we think it belongs to. When we preserve a place, who are we preserving it for? When we protect cultural heritage, whose culture are we centering? When we tell stories about the past, whose voices are we amplifying? Easter Island, the symbol, belongs to everyone. It's human heritage, a testament to what people can achieve, a marker of human history. But Rapa Nui, the place, belongs to the Rapa Nui people. It's their home, their land, their ancestors, their future. The world has chosen to embrace the symbol while ignoring the place, to celebrate the past while neglecting the present, to preserve the stones while forgetting the people. You've seen this island before, in photographs, in films, in books. You know what it looks like. You know the statues, but you don't know Rapa Nui. Because knowing would require more than looking at images. It would require listening to voices that have been silenced, understanding history that has been buried, confronting truths that are uncomfortable. The island everyone knows is a fiction. Beautiful, mysterious, tragic in a distant, romanticized way. The island nobody knows is real, complex, still struggling with the consequences of decisions made centuries ago by people who thought rocks in the ocean were empty until proven otherwise. The Moai are facing the wrong direction. They're looking inland, watching over the island, protecting the people, the way they were always meant to. But the world only sees them from behind, looking at the backs of the statues, missing what they're actually looking at. Maybe it's time to walk around, to see what the ancestors are watching, to notice the people still living under their gaze. The island everyone knows, the island nobody knows, they're the same place. We just haven't been paying attention.